Hello all my JavaScript friends, this is the Virtuoid, aka Mike Smith, and this is Fun with JavaScript, our cache defense game. This video is going to cover our Monster controller, basically along the same lines of all of our other different controllers. Now its particular job is to be able to control, that's the word controller, all the different monsters that are going to be appearing in the game. And this specifically is all the different little entities that are going to be attacking our cache defense to be able to take us down and end the game. So this is going to be relatively simple at the very beginning. And once we start really fleshing out the game, that's where we're going to really start delving into the details of what the monsters are going to look like. But for now, we're just going to build this simple controller. As always, you can go to github.com/thevirtuoid/FWJS-cache-defense to get all of our latest code. It is located on the main branch, and all the code is completely, totally free. You can do with it whatever you wish. You can also email me anytime at thevirtuoid@gmail.com. And finally, you can go to https://funwithjavascript.com to see all of our Fun with JavaScript videos. All right, let's get started on the Monster controller. We'll create a new file here, and this our new JavaScript file. This is going to be our test engine. Now, unfortunately, the way this is setting up here, you're not able to see that I'm typing in the word MonsterController.cy, but it should show up in the directory listing. And let's just go to the directory listing, and I'll show you that here real quick. And boom, there it is, MonsterController. JS, that's MonsterController.cy.js. This is going to be our Cypress testing suite for testing the Monster controller. Again, we're using TDD here, test-driven development, in which case we're going to write our test first before we write any code. Watch everything fail, and then write the code to be able to satisfy all the different tests. So now that we've gotten that, let's get going and figure out the code we're going to need to put in here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pop in the code, and then we're going to tell you what's going on with it. And through the magic of television, there it is. Let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit on that code. Let's take a look at what we're doing. This is going to be just the actual creation itself. Monster controller, we're just going to test the creation, and we will make sure that it should be able to create the test. See if I can click on the right button. There it is. We're just going to create a Monster controller and just make sure that the Monster controller is true. This is something I kind of add with a lot of my different controllers, that if I ever have some defaults, I'll add those defaults in here. For right now, we're not having any defaults for Monster controller because it's going to be something very simple. But this is all there really is. So if we were to run this, everything should start should basically blow up. So let's go ahead and get everything set up. The first thing I want to do is we're going to go to our command prompt, and within the command prompt, what we're going to type in is npx Cypress open, and then we'll let it do its thing. Okay, and once it's done its thing, we should be able to go to the browser, and the browser will say welcome to Cypress, and we're going to click on E2E testing, which has already been configured. It's going to ask us to choose a particular browser. We'll start E2E testing in Chrome. This will open up another window, in which case we'll start doing our testing. Okay, let's take a look at that new window. There's the new window, and here's a listing of all of our different controllers that we're currently working on. And so what we want to do here is we want to run Monster controller, which is located right here. So once we run Monster controller by clicking on it, it'll bring up this screen and it'll crash on us. And I'm not going to go into kind of zooming or anything, but the reason it crashed is that it got a Webpack compilation error because it couldn't find MonsterController.js. That's because we haven't created our controller at all. Isn't that weird how that works? So let's sit back over to our web browser. Let's just click over to our directory, actually. And once we're into our directory, let's collapse this part. Let's collapse this part here. And inside the controllers, we have those four controllers. Just create our controller file. And again, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to see it. So I'm going to create a new JavaScript file called MonsterController. And we've just created that. So let's take a look at the code and let's go ahead and add some code in there. Okay, and through the magic of television, we have our Monster controller. Now that we have saved it off, technically our testing should work. So let's click on the Cypress test again and take a look at it. And let's zoom in a little bit there. And yep, there it is. Our test now work. So let's go back over to our test. Obviously, we're going to have to do a whole lot more of this test. So what are the different things that we want to do with the Monster controller? So basically we want to do 4 different things. We want to be able to create a monster. We want to, in fact, be able to tell the controller, hey, give me a monster, and the controller will give it back to us. We will be able to retrieve a particular monster. So if we can give it a monster of some sort of, I guess, ID out, an ID or something, we'd be able to say, hey, give me a monster number ID, and it will give it to us. We want to be able to remove that monster because obviously once our weapons beat up on the monster, we want to be able to say, hey, monster, get on out of here. So we'll be able to remove the monster. And then finally, we want to basically be able to initialize the controller itself. And that basically allows us to be able to set up any kind of default variables or anything within the controller that we know we're going to need. So let's take those one at a time. Let's take a look, first of all, at our createMonster unit test. So let me copy that in there. And there we have it. So the createMonster now basically allows us to be able to use our TDD to decide, hey, what's this monster going to look like? What are some of the default characteristics of our monster? Well, basically, when we do a createMonster, I want to be able to run it in a certain way in which I want to say, I want to create a particular monster that is of a particular type. So we now know that we're going to need a couple of different basically a monster type, and we'll be getting that in just a second. But here's our createMonster routine, and this is basically all I want to do, and it's going to be able to basically throw back to or give back to us a particular monster, and that can be found on this second one. In fact, let's zoom to the bottom here and see if I can see that better. Yeah, there we go. There we go. So it should be able to create a monster. So I would expect that when we create a monster, that what value will return back is going to be an instance of a monster class. So now we also know we're going to need to have some sort of monster class. And then finally, we're going to say it should be able to create a monster with a specific ID. And that basically now says that when we do a createMonster, I want to not only pass a type, but I want to pass it a particular ID. That also means that the ID is going to probably be a default, which means I'm going to need some sort of routine within my monster to be able to produce default IDs. So suddenly just be able to create a monster has suddenly got a whole lot of different things going on here. We're going to need some sort of monster typing or some sort of way to be able to say that we got different monster types. We're going to need to be able to have an actual monster class that will represent a particular monster. And finally, we know that when we create the monster, the type is going to be required because that's what's going to happen here. But the ID is optional, which means we need to automatically generate an ID. So basically, let's go ahead and, well, actually, we don't need to back up. Let's just go ahead and create our monster code there. Actually, before we do that, I just did a save on the createMonster. Let's go over to our Cypress test screen. And as you can see, yeah, we got a bunch of different errors there because a lot of it is that we don't have any kind of createMonster routine inside there. Let's see if let me pull that up there. Yeah, MonsterType is not defined. And yeah, actually that's the big thing here is MonsterType is not defined. So now that we got MonsterType is not defined, let's go ahead and let's create our MonsterType. So let's go back over into Zoom. Actually, we'll go back into the directory. Let's go back into the directory, and we got a specific area where we collect our types, and that's located right here. So let's create a new JavaScript file, and we're going to call that one MonsterType. And let's go to the code, and let's pop some code inside there. Okay, and we've typed the code inside there. We're just defining one monster type right now called an alien. So if we had different monster types, we would basically create the different monsters as, within these monster types themselves. So this will help us identify different monsters as we create those different monsters. And right now we don't have different monsters, we just have one monster, and we'll call it an alien monster. So once we save that, we can then restart our Cypress test. Let me get over to the Zoom, and we should be getting different types of errors. So actually, let me go to the main test here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click right here for run all test. We're going to run all test. And it still says MonsterType is not defined. And that's because, guess what we forgot to do? We forgot to import it. So let's go back over to MonsterController. And let's import the MonsterType. MonsterType. All right, whoop. Wrong key. Let's try that again. Control S. Let's save it. Let's go over to our Cypress test screen. And there, now we got a different error. As you can tell there, we got MonsterController.createMonster is not a function, which is the kind of error we expected. So we've created our monster type. Now let's create our createMonster method. Let's flip back over into Zoom, and let's go into our monster. Well, there's a createMonster within the monsters, but our problem here is that I'm sorry. There's a create. I can't get my brain out here. There's a createMonster inside the MonsterController. So let's go over to MonsterController, and let's type in the createMonster code. And there it is. So we got the createMonster code, but now we got a couple of different things. You know, now we're to the point is how do we want to store all these monsters? So I'm going to need to be able to create a mapping to store the monsters themselves. So let's go ahead and go up to the top there and type in monsters equals new map. That should take care of that. I'm just going to check my code here, make sure I've got that correct. Yep, I've got that correct. Okay, so we got monsters equals new map, but now notice also we have this section right here, which means we need to have a monster class. Well, we really can't have a monster class here without writing our test first. So now we got to kind of stop for a minute or two and sit there and go, okay, now we need to write our test for our monster. So what do we need our basic monster class to look like? So let's go back into our directory, and let's go into our E2E at the very top, and let's type in monster, or let's create a new JavaScript file. And that new JavaScript file is going to be called monster.cy.js, and there it is until it got created. It's a blank page, so let's flip over to the page itself. And let's go ahead and, what are we going to do here? Yep. Oh, yeah, let's go ahead and copy in the monster Cypress test. And through the magic of television, we have it all ready to go here. We just want to basically create the monster itself. So let's take a look at the code for the creation. So when we create the monster, what do we want to do? Well, basically, when we actually want to create the object itself, we just want to be able to pass the type. And that's pretty much it. And if we pass the type, we want to make sure that monster is equal to true. We also want to be able to say that if we do not pass a type, it's going to give a particular error message. And that's because basically we're now making type to be a not be default, any kind of defaults. You have to specify some sort of type when you do the monster. Remember back in our controller. Let's go back to the controller itself here. We sat there and said that, hey, okay, that when we can pass an ID, but if we don't pass an ID, we're going to have to be able to create the monster. So therefore, we're going to need some sort of default ID. So within our test here, we want to make sure that it does do a default ID, so that when we pass just the type, we're just going to check to make sure it's a string, because it's going to be a UUID string. So there's no way I can test for a specific string. To test for a specific string, that's what this very last one is going to do. And here we're going to pass the ID, and we're going to test to have it to test that the ID did get passed. So those are our different tests for monsters. So once we get that done, let's go back now to our Cypress screen. And within our Cypress screen, we should now see monster, and it is. So let's do monster. And when we do monster, we get an error message saying that we cannot resolve monster.js because we haven't created a class yet. Of course, that's what we expect to do. So let's go back into Zoom and let's create that class. So back into Zoom, let's collapse that. Let's collapse that. And within classes, let's create a new class called Monster. .js, and let's copy some code. And through the magic of television, here is our code. And basically what I did here is I just copied this code out here because it's very, very easy what we've done here. We've extended the base game item because we want everything to be off of the base game item. Here is our static error message that we have, and that matches the error message that we said it was going to throw within our MonsterController. So our constructor here should be able to take care of this first test. The second test right here, if it's incorrect, will be taken care of right here, because basically we split out the args and we're just looking for type. And if we don't have a type, we're getting it from MonsterTypes. Let's go back over to MonsterTypes. There's MonsterTypes. This is where we're getting it from. And once we know that it's not in there, then we throw the error. We call super, and that calls all the initialization on the base game item, and then we set our type. So that should be able to set this and this. So where did that default ID come from? Well, that came from the base game item, because within the base game item, we go ahead and set a default ID if the ID is not been set. Right here. There it is. I couldn't find it for a second there. So there's the default, basically saying, hey, you know, if ID is set, if ID is not set, the default to UUID version 4. And we've done that many, many times, so it's no big deal. So that completes our MonsterJS. That should now satisfy everything inside the monster test. So let's flip back over to our test. And, oh, yep, it automatically reran it. And there we go. All of our monster now works. So now that all of our monster works, we should now be able to go back over to MonsterController and see what happens there. Monster is not defined. Why is monster not defined? Well, actually, let's zoom in on that so you can see the error message. There it is. See, monster not defined. Well, why is monster not defined? It's because we haven't imported anything. So let's now go back over to MonsterController. Not MonsterController, MonsterController CY. Yep, there we go. And let's import monster. Now that we've imported monster, we've saved it. We should now go back over to our, we should be able to go back over to our Cypress test. And it still says monster is not defined inside MonsterController. Oh, phooey. I forgot to find, it wasn't inside MonsterController. Well, I'm sorry, it's inside MonsterController.js, not the test that we should have done. So I don't think I needed to do this part here. Actually, I did need to do it here because within should create the monster. Yeah. Okay, that worked because I needed to have that inside there. You're not being able to see what I'm doing here. There we go. Yeah, I will make sure. Yeah, I did actually need to import monster inside the MonsterController because we do test for instance of monster there. But let's go back over to the MonsterController.javascript file. Let's get back up to the top. And this is where we need to import it. So let's import import monster from models.js. I don't think that's right. Yep, made a mistake. Import monsters from there. That's the correct one. Sorry, I just said I used ChatGPT to help me do some pair programming basically, and it gave me the wrong stuff. In fact, I'm going to do a video on that. It's pretty cool later on. But anyway, so I now imported monster, and that solves that one. So once we save that off, we should now be able to go back to our Cypress. And yep, our MonsterController now passes for createMonster. Now that we've spent a long time on that one because the createMonster also forced us to be able to had to create not only the monster controller class, but it had to create the monster class, which also had made us create the MonsterType class and the test for the monster class. Just so, again, we're using TDD to get everything up and running. So, MonsterController works great. Monster itself, yep, as you can see there, monster still works, MonsterController still works, so all that is hunky-dory. So what's next? Well, one of the first things we wanted to do here was to be able to create the monster. Next thing I wanted to do is I wanted to be able to get an actual monster. So let's pop the code inside for that and see what that looks like. We'll go over to MonsterController. .javascript, the JavaScript file for MonsterController, and let's pop that code in. And through the magic of television, there it is. Here's our getMonster. It's going to be very, very simple. We should return null if the monster cannot be found. So if we're basically creating our own monster here for our test purposes with its own ID. And basically, I should be able to call getMonster, and it should return null if the IDs do not match. And if they do match, I should be able to actually get the monster itself. And it should, in fact, this new monster instance here that gets passed should be exactly the same as the monster that we created right here. So that's a very simple test to do. So if we save this, that should make our test fail. So let's go over to our Zoom, and yep, they fail because module getMonster is not a function. So let's flip back over. In fact, let's go back to the top here. Let's go back over to our Monster controller and let's throw the code inside there to be able to do the getMonster. And there we have it, getMonster. As you can tell here, we're basically doing monsters get ID or null. Now, why am I doing or null there? Well, because the problem is here is that the get method on a map, and as you can tell, we're defining it here as a new map. The get method on a map returns an undefined, which technically is the most correct thing. I don't like undefined, and this is, you know, call me wrong, it doesn't matter, but I'd rather return null than undefined. I know I'm wrong. I'm too old to change. I'll try to change, but for now, I want to return null. Again, this is my game. This is my TDD. If I want to return null, I'll return null. So I'm going to return null there instead of return undefined. So once we save all that, we should be able to go now back to our Cypress, and it should getMonster should now work. And sure enough, as you can tell, getMonster works. So that was rinky-dink simple. There was not much there. What is the next thing that we want to do? We got the monster, we create the monster, we got the monster, we want to be able to remove the monster. So let's go over to our MonsterController and let's type in, or let's get the code there for the removeMonster. And in the magic of television, there it is. It's going to be very easy here. Basically, we should be able to return false if the monster cannot be found. So basically what we want to do here is we want to be able to use the removeMonster method to say, hey, remove this particular monster based upon the ID. So we're going, when we call removeMonster missing, and because we created a test monster there, removeMonster missing should come out to be false. And that basically means that, hey, you know, your remove operation didn't do anything. I'm not going to throw an error or anything. I'm just going to say, hey, your remove operation didn't give you what you wanted, so I'm going to return false. What I'm going to return if it did do it, I'm going to return true if it did happen. So if we do a removeMonster and it comes up to be true, then we know we removed the monster. And then just to be sure that everything works, I'm going to run a getMonster and make sure that getMonster has come back to be null. So that's just kind of, this is just kind of a little double check to make sure that the remove has actually done what it's supposed to do. So if we save all of that and we run back to our Cypress test, notice it's going to say right there, MonsterController.removeMonster is not a function. Of course it's not a function because we haven't put it in there yet. So if we go to Monster itself, monster, wrong one. Try again. If we go to MonsterController.JavaScript, the JavaScript file for MonsterController, let's throw in the code for removeMonster. And through the magic of television, there it is. Let's zoom it, let's scroll it up to see what it looks like. Yep, there it is, removeMonster ID. And we're just going to return the delete method that is part of the map object for JavaScript, because delete will return a true or false depending upon whether the key was deleted or not. So now that once we save all of that, we should now be able to go back to our Cypress and it should be all green. Let's scroll that up a little bit here. Can you see that? I don't think you can see that. There we go. So you can see it now. All right, there we go. Okay, so there's the removeMonster. As you can tell, there our two functions now our two tests now work on removeMonster. So the last thing we want to do is we want to be able to now go back into our code and create an initialization routine, because I always like to put initialization routines inside there to be able to take care of any kind of variables. It also allows me to initialize if I wanted to reinitialize a controller or anything like that, I can always call the initialization routine to reinitialize the controller without having to create a whole new controller. So let's pop some code in there to show you how that works. Let's get on the MonsterController cy.js and let's pop some code. And through the magic of television, there it is. So basically what I'm going to create two monsters within the MonsterController on the before each. I really just have one routine here. And it just basically says that once I initialize the MonsterController, once I run the initial controller, I want to make sure that all the old monsters were taken out. So what I've done here is I have created the MonsterController, popped two monsters inside there. But when I initialize it, I want to make sure everything is cleared out. So I just basically now test to make sure that both of those monsters are no longer there. And that kind of helps guarantee me that it's been cleared out. And later on, if we do add more variables that get initialized, we'll be able to take care of that. So if we do a Control S and we flip over to our Cypress, It says, you can tell there, it says MonsterController.initialize is not a function. Well, shock, shock, surprise, surprise. So let's now go over, we'll zoom back to the bottom. Let's now go over and let's pop some code inside of our MonsterController. And through the magic of television, there it is. That's all it really needs to be, really needs to be done, because we only have just one variable. If we scroll up to the top here, we just have one variable we're looking at. So once we have done that, all we really need to do is to clear out that particular monster. So if we do add more variables, we'll need to change this initialization routine and change our test to make sure that we've covered everything that we need to change. And right now it's just one variable. One thing I do want to kind of show you here that I want to do is notice that my constructor is completely empty. I do on the constructor want to go ahead and say this initialize, because anytime this allows me now to have the constructor to automatically initialize all the variables that I need to have initialized with that are within the initialization routine. And this saves me from having to do funky things within the constructor and funky things within the initialize. There's always one source of truth for the initialization routines, for initializing the controllers. So that we've initialized the monster controller itself, we should now be able to go into our test to see what happens. And it looks like our tests are now clear. Let's see, creation is clear. createMonster is now clear. getMonster is now clear. removeMonster is now clear. As you can tell there, initialize is now clear too. So one of the things we want to test is, let's go to our main screen here, is we want to make sure all of our different controllers are still working, because we've done a lot of work here. Well, not a lot, but we've done some work with the monster controller, the monsters, and the MonsterType. So I just kind of want to have a gut check to make sure all of the other tests are still running. So we'll click on Arsenal controller, make sure it's still working. It is. The base game item is still working. The board controller, yep, it's still working. The cache controller, it's still working. The game it's still working. Item position is still working. Monster is still working. Monster controller is still working. It should be working. Better be working. We just worked on it. Road is still working. Road controller is still working. And finally, weapon is still working. So that gives us that makes sure that all of our unit tests are still working, the previous ones we worked on, but that now completes the monster and the monster controller. So now we can basically start working on, what is it that's the next thing we're going to be working on? Ah, yes, okay, it's going to be the cache tower controller, blah, 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 blah. Then after that, it's going to be the web workers, which is going to be the really fun part. So again, that completes everything that you need to know, at least for right now, for the monsters and the monster controller. Thank you very much for watching. If you like this video, please click on the like button below. If you wish to keep informed about new content, click on the subscribe button. And as always, please leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Again, thank you very much for watching. This is the Virtuoid, aka Mike Smith. We'll see you later.